Today we take a very historic action that was 45 years in the making. In a few moments, I will sign an executive order to begin eliminating the Federal Department of Education once and for all. And it sounds strange, doesn't it? Department of Education, we're going to eliminate it, and everybody knows it's right. And the Democrats know it's right, and I hope they're going to be voting for it because ultimately it may come before them, but everybody knows it's right, and we have to get our children educated. We're not doing well with the world of education in this country, and we haven't for a long time.
Before we hear from the liberal media reacting to Trump's decision to close or sign an executive order to close the Department of Education, there's also going to be some arguments about who really has the power to do that. Before we get into all that, let's see first not just how his cabinet, his team is eloquently explaining the logic of such a decision, but let's first see how old President Ronald Reagan first suggested the idea of getting this power of the Department of Education gone, making it gone, and returning it back to the states. It was not a new idea. It's Sean Daniel here. If you enjoyed the video, consider hitting that like button or subscribing. And let's get into the video. Look at that beautiful signature.
I propose, and would have already started, if your hypothesis is correct, a planned and orderly transfer back to the states and local communities of functions the federal government has usurped and which it has proven it is incapable of operating. And one of the first of those would be welfare. One of the second would be in the field of education. I would like to dissolve the $10 billion National Department of Education created by President Carter and turn schools back to the local school districts where we built the greatest public school system the world has ever seen. I think I can make a case that the decline in the quality of public education began when federal aid became federal interference.
So this is not a new idea, but to many Americans, it will come across as a new, radical, wild idea. So how is the Trump administration going to sell this to the public? Let's hear from the press secretary.
Where was their criticism of our nation's failing test scores for the last several decades? The Department of Education was founded in the 1970s, and since then we have spent more than $3 trillion at this federal bureaucracy. What has been the return on that investment for the American taxpayer? Levels that are less than ideal, less than proficient. Our children's test scores are incredibly concerning when it comes to reading rates, literacy rates, math, and science test scores. The numbers prove that, and the president is finally, this president is finally taking much needed action to return education to where it belongs, and that's to educators closest to students in their classrooms in their respective states. We're going to have a great event here later at 4 o'clock. There will be students here, teachers here, parents here, educators, and of course governors from around the country who are very excited about taking on this responsibility to educate our nation's students.
Who's going to run federal student loans?
So the Department of Education will be much smaller than it is today. As you know, the president's executive order directed Linda McMahon to greatly minimize the agency. So when it comes to student loans and Pell Grants, those will still be run out of the Department of Education, but we don't need to be spending more than $3 trillion over the course of a few decades on a department that's clearly failing in its initial intention to educate our students.
So is the federal government going to be spending
less?
less?
Much smaller than it is. Is it not going to be shut down completely? And then I have a second question.
As I said, Pell Grants and student loans will still be run out of the department in Washington, D.C., but the great responsibility of educating our nation's students will return to the states.
And the Department of Education plays a critical role in enforcing civil rights laws that prohibit discrimination. Who's going to do that now?
Any critical functions of the department, such as that, will remain. But again, we're greatly reducing the scale and the size of this department.
Without even getting into the idea of centralizing power to D.C. that spreads all throughout the nation in regards to education, just the idea that she shared about returning the power and decision-making to people closest to the students, because people in D.C. are far removed from that, that logic makes a lot of sense. But now let's hear from my favorite buddy, whiz kid, genius man Stephen Miller, on the complexities of why this decision was made.
Why is the administration looking today to issue executive orders to dismantle the Department of Education?
Well, as we know, the Department of Education here in Washington, D.C. is overwhelmingly staffed by radical left Marxist bureaucrats who are in every way hostile to Western civilization, hostile to American interests, and hostile to our founding documents and culture. And so they are using their position and influence inside the Department of Education to try to force agendas like radical gender ideology, like critical race theory, like diversity, equity, and inclusion, and all kinds of anti-America curricula and policies on the American people, on our students, on our children. So it's taking away from parents the ability to control and direct the education of their own kids, of their own families. So what we're going to do under President Trump's leadership and direction is to return that authority to the greatest extent possible to the local level where parents can control outcomes, while at the same time making sure that no federal funds are used to support racism, to support gender ideology, or support other ideas and principles that are offensive to the American taxpayer.
Doesn't that just make sense? We already know in D.C. how liberal and leftist they are, how they want to push the liberal agenda everywhere. And we also know that no matter how riled up parents get, no matter how many school board meetings they go to, if there is a curriculum put in place and legalized, let's say, by a federal organization like the Department of Education, it doesn't matter how many parents go and protest, go to school board meetings, try to get things changed. It doesn't matter. If the Department of Education wants to teach about transgenderism, wants to teach about critical race theory, wants to teach about gender studies to kids that are 7, 10, 11 years old, it doesn't matter what the parents do. So this makes a lot more sense. Allow the parents to actually have a say in the education. And maybe more parents will not pull their kids out of public school, because based on things we've seen, they teach some wild stuff now on the liberal left-leaning side in public schools. Now let's start hearing about the CNN people. Now let's hear from some of these leftists about their reaction to Trump making this bold stance.
Randi Weingarten is with us now. She's the president of the American Federation of Teachers, which has about 1.8 million members, including educators from pre-K through 12th grade. Randi, just tell us, what is your biggest concern when it comes to essentially shutting down the Department of Education?
So thanks for having me. And the biggest concern is all the opportunity gaps that the federal government provides through the Department of Education. The federal education role is limited. There's no, except for, the Department of Defense schools, which are not run from the Department of Education, or the Bureau of Indian Affairs schools that are not run by the Department of Education. It doesn't control any schools. In fact, it's the states that control schools. So if President Trump doesn't like what's happening in education, it's the states and local school boards that do.
You sure she's not mad about all the money that's going to the Department of Education and now it's just going to be gone? Because why would Trump do all of that if there's already power in the states? Just a reminder, this was this same lady in COVID demanding that all schools close.
And if people are in high risk, they shouldn't be in school. They should be doing things remotely. Just because Donald Trump wants to take a risk with people who go to bars or beaches, those of us who have spent our life teaching kids are not going to take a risk with kids or with our members' lives.
Remote and hybrid are really the only two ways you can reopen schools safely.
Now let's get to the good stuff.
There are conservative, liberal, progressive, agnostic, whatever, parents out there who are like, holy crap, what does this mean? Especially if they have like a special ed kid, or especially if they have a kid with special needs who are poor or whatever. What do you think of that argument? I'm not saying that they're going to be left by the wayside because of this, but do you think that President Trump needs to talk more about that?
See how they immediately try to victimize and wave a little flag to act like Trump's going to take a blind eye to people with disabilities? What?
Perhaps. I mean, this is day one of this, right? So let's give this some time to marinate. You've worked for a city. I've worked for a governor. Every state has a Department of Education. They have 3, 4, or 5 of them. So don't worry, bureaucracy is not going away. It's alive and well. As a governor, governors are cheering this, right? Less mandates from Washington, less direction from Washington. Let governors do their jobs. Bring education decisions back to the states, back to the class.
What decisions do they are being mandated right now? That like you work for which governor?
Christie, Governor.
So you work for Governor Christie. What governors were told you can't do what you want to do?
Look at the Democrat governor of Hawaii, right,
Okay.
who actually has the courage to speak up and say this.
Governor Green. Yeah.
Yes, unfunded mandates coming from Washington. You have to do this. They handcuff states. Mandates.
Well, but some of those mandates are you've got to get your reading scores up. Some of those mandates are you've got to make sure your fourth graders and your eighth graders, your scores you've been failing for decades or years, and whatever it is you've been doing isn't working. For the Title I money we're going to give you, you've got to make sure that your poor kids, that you're spending the resources adequately to make sure your poor children are reading on grade level. So it's not, when you talk about these mandates, I mean, I think, conservatives have reduced this to bathrooms. Who gets to go to what bathroom and who gets to play what sports? When, again, we are in a national crisis. Our children cannot read. They are behind in math. And we're talking about jobs and careers of the future, and they're behind.
To bring up the point about trans people and bathrooms and different people identifying which bathroom they can go into, that's a good topic to take a stand on. It's not something to dismiss like this lady tries to insinuate. Also, how many classes do you think are mandated by the federal government, by the Department of Education? Your kids need to have this class, they need to pass this class, they need to be at a high level in this class. How many of those classes and subjects do you think, now that I'm sure most of you guys are adults that watch this, do you think those classes and subjects didn't even benefit you in life at all? But yet you had to, because of some mandate put in by the state or the federal government, you had to take this amount of classes for math, this amount of classes for history, this amount of classes for some, what else could we say, English level, reading level stuff. How many of those things actually benefited you in life? But because some bureaucrats, some people on a school board put it together, you had to take those classes. And I argue a lot of those people on those school boards that made those decisions didn't do anything with their life outside of being in education. Just a hypothesis. Let me know what you think. Now let's finish it off with my boy Joey Joe over here.
Yeah, they're billionaires, and they're disconnected. I mean, Elon Musk's so radically disconnected. He doesn't. Yeah, ask Elon Musk. So how does this work when you let Florida or Utah or Ohio run education? You know, when we were talking about it, if you had asked Jeb Bush, how's it work? Jeb would say, well, here's what we're doing in Florida. If you ask Mitt Romney in Utah, how would you use this money? He'd say, this is what we're doing. George Voinovich in Ohio, they'd go down the list. That's just a different world. That's a different age. That's a different century. What we're seeing with Elon Musk is cuts by chainsaw. There is no method to the madness. It's just cut first and hurt Americans later. That's what's happening. And by the way, as the biggest defense hawk, as the biggest budget hawk of anybody you certainly see in Washington, D.C., because I was there when we balanced the budget 4 years in a row, these cuts will not do anything to balance the budget if you're not willing to say no to tax cuts for billionaires and multinational corporations, if you're not willing to cut at the Pentagon, if you're not willing to look at wealthier Americans with Social Security and start talking about means testing. Millionaires needing Social Security, billionaires needing social, come on, it's ridiculous. But they're not going to talk about that. They're going to go after food programs for poor kids. They're going to take breakfast and lunch away from poor kids, but they will not take tax cuts away from billionaires. If you're the Democratic Party, I just got to say, if you're the Democratic Party and you can't win, please go sell used cars because you're in the wrong business.
A random tirade that made no sense about tax cuts, about poor kids. The states are still going to take care of those people. States have funding as well. So that doesn't even make any sense. Honestly, don't even know why we showed that clip. Why I showed that clip. He's just always offers something ridiculous. His hair looks good, though. I bet he doesn't take any tax cuts or budget cuts on getting his hair done, because that thing looks nice, Joe. But let me know what you guys think. Is this a wise decision by Trump or not? I think it is, just by the fact of what Caroline Leavitt said in the beginning, in returning decision-making power for education back to those closest to the actual students and families. The families in the neighborhoods, in the areas, can actually go to board meetings, cause a fuss, get some people behind them to maybe make change happen, whereas if the decisions are made in Washington, they have no chance to get those decisions changed. I think it's a good move. Let me know what you think. It's itsSeanDaniel here. If you guys want to watch another video, I'll have some right here, and I'll see you in the next one. Consider subscribing if you want to see more.